Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into this one.
So I want you to imagine, just for a moment, paying your annual taxes to the IRS with a bounced check. Like a check you knew was just utterly worthless.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a terrifying thought.
Right. Or picture handing your boss a project that you literally just pulled out of the office recycling bin, just covered in coffee stains, and you're presenting it as your absolute best work.
You would be fired by lunch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You wouldn't dare. I mean, the consequences would be immediate and severe, yet thousands of years ago, an entire society convinced themselves they could get away with doing exactly that. And not just to a boss or, a tax collector.
To the creator of the universe.
Yeah. They were handing over their garbage and essentially expecting a pat on the back.
Yeah.
So today we are stepping into the ancient world of the biblical book of Malachi.
It is such a fascinating book.
It really is. We have the text itself, all 4 chapters, and we are going to look at it through the lens of 2 towering figures of classical commentary, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
2 absolute legends in the field.
For sure. And our mission today is to mine this text for its practical wisdom, its moral insight, and really its profound relevance to how we live today. Because, well, while the setting is ancient, the psychological profile of the people Malachi is speaking to, it is startlingly modern.
It really is.
They were deeply cynical, chronically apathetic, and fundamentally exhausted.
Yeah, and to truly grasp the weight of what Malachi is saying, to understand why his message cuts so deep, we really have to immerse ourselves in the human context of his era.
Right, because this isn't just, a theological treatise dropped from the sky.
Exactly. It's an urgent intervention into the emotional and spiritual state of a real community. So we're looking at the Israelites who have returned from their long, bitter exile in Babylon.
And they had been away for a long time.
Right. Oh, for generations. They had been held captive, and they were sustained only by these soaring, magnificent prophecies from people like Isaiah and Ezekiel.
Like these huge promises of glory.
Right. They were promised that when they finally returned home to Jerusalem, it would be an era of unparalleled glory. The streets would be safe, the wealth of the nations would flow into their city, and, well, the grand historic temple would be rebuilt in absolute splendor.
So they have this incredible vision in their heads.
Exactly. So they make this arduous journey back. They finally rebuild the temple. They're back on their ancestral soil. But the glorious, wealthy, independent kingdom they had built up in their minds,
It didn't happen.
it simply hasn't materialized, not even close.
So they're essentially living in this minor, struggling, dusty province, right? And they are just under the massive, unyielding thumb of the Persian Empire.
Yeah, that grand vision collided with a very, very gritty reality. The Persian Empire is this global superpower, wealthy beyond imagination, and the Israelites are just a tiny footnote in their vast administrative machine.
Wow, that has to hurt.
It does. They are poor. They are facing brutal agricultural failures. Pests are ravaging their crops. They are experiencing crushing economic stagnation.
So they are broke and hungry.
Right. And the psychological result of this massive gap between their expectations and their reality is, well, it's a profound spiritual and emotional hangover.
A hangover. That is the perfect word for it.
Yeah, they are just going through the motions of their daily lives. They feel completely shortchanged by the universe. God didn't deliver the utopia they thought they were owed, so their daily actions have begun to reflect this deep underlying cynicism.
But it's not like they're actively rebelling, are they? Like, they aren't burning the temple down.
No, they aren't rebelling in dramatic theatrical ways. They aren't erecting giant golden statues or completely renouncing their faith. It's much more insidious.
How so?
They are quietly, persistently, and frankly, comfortably apathetic.
Man, I am listening to this and thinking about how perfectly that maps onto the human experience right now. Like, for you listening, how often do we enter a new phase of life expecting an absolute honeymoon only to hit a brick wall?
All the time.
Right. You finally land that dream job you spent years studying for, or you get married, or you make a massive cross-country move to a new city, and you have this highly idealized vision of what your life is about to become.
And then reality sets in.
Then you hit the reality of a Tuesday morning, I mean, the bills still have to be paid. The commute is still an hour long. The relationship requires difficult, really unglamorous compromises.
Yeah, the sheer friction of daily life.
Exactly. And that friction, especially when it doesn't meet our lofty expectations, it can so easily breed apathy. We start cutting corners. We stop bringing our absolute best to the table.
Which brings us right into the overarching theme of Malachi chapter 1. That exact psychological state. That disappointment curdling into bare minimum effort.
The tragedy of the leftovers.
Yes, the tragedy of the leftovers, and this creeping, quiet contempt for the things we claim are sacred. Malachi chapter 1 opens with what should be an incredibly comforting, poignant statement from the divine.
What does it say?
God simply says, I have loved you.
Which sounds beautiful.
It does. But the people's response is jarring. They immediately, almost defensively, push back and demand, how have you loved us?
Wow. Just throwing it right back in his face.
Because they doubt this love, Because their economic and social circumstances are so difficult, they begin to fundamentally compromise on their most sacred commitments.
Okay, so what did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, the text describes how they started bringing the blind, the lame, and the sick animals for their sacrifices. They were offering what the text bluntly calls polluted bread on the altar.
Wait, so they are literally walking up to the sacred altar of their community with defective, dying livestock.
Exactly.
Help me understand the mechanics of this, because to a modern mind, animal sacrifice is completely foreign. Like, what did this actually mean in their daily economy?
That's a great question. In an agrarian society, your livestock is your wealth. It's your bank account, your 401k, and your livelihood all rolled into one.
Right, it's real money.
And Matthew Henry makes a brilliant and cutting observation about human nature here. He points out that the people brought the absolute worst they had.
Because they didn't want to waste the good ones.
Exactly. These were animals that were totally unsellable at the local market. They couldn't use them for their own flocks because, well, a blind or lame animal is a liability. It will slow down the herd or die anyway.
So they were essentially doing the math.
Yes. They said, well, the law requires us to offer a sacrifice to God. Let's just give him the ones that are practically useless to us anyway.
That is so cynical.
It is. They figured that way we fulfilled a religious requirement without actually costing ourselves anything of value. Henry notes they'd come to view the entire sacred process as a burden.
Like checking a box.
Worse than that. The text in Malachi 1.13 says they literally sniffed at it or puffed at it.
Puffed at it, like an eye roll.
Exactly like an eye roll. It was a gesture of open contempt. They were treating their highest spiritual duty as an annoying, onerous chore they just wanted to get over with.
And this is where Albert Barnes brings up that incredible biting analogy about the Persian governor, right? The prophet calls out the sheer hypocrisy of their actions.
He does, and it's a masterful rhetorical move by Malachi. Barnes highlights the supreme irony in verse 8. The prophet challenges the people, saying, present it now to your governor. Will he be pleased with you or show you favor?
Which is a great point.
Right, because Judah was governed by a Persian official, a pasha, who demanded tribute and taxes. If an Israelite farmer tried to pay his taxes to this local Persian warlord with a sick, dying, worthless sheep,
He'd be dead.
exactly, it would be rejected immediately as a blatant insult. The farmer would likely be imprisoned or executed. They wouldn't dare offer these second-rate defective gifts to a human authority who could punish them.
But they feel perfectly comfortable doing it to God.
Yes. They feel perfectly justified offering them to the creator of the universe. They fear the earthly governor more than they revere the divine.
Because they know God isn't going to strike them with lightning on the spot. So they take advantage of the patience of the sacred while being absolutely terrified of the immediate wrath of the secular.
That is exactly the dynamic.
Which makes me think about how this translates today. I mean, we aren't dragging blind sheep to a stone altar, obviously, but the human tendency to give our leftovers to the things we claim to value most, I mean, that is universally relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
It is entirely about the quality of our attention, our energy, and our resources.
Precisely. It comes down to where we spend our premium currency, our best hours, our sharpest mental acuity, our deepest emotional reserves.
Think about the rhythm of a standard modern week. We will give our best, most energetic, highly caffeinated hours to our employers because they hold the paycheck.
Right. They are our modern Persian governors.
Exactly. Or we give our absolute sharpest mental focus to scrolling on our phones,
Yeah.
just consuming media for 3 hours straight in the evening, giving our full psychological engagement to algorithms.
Yeah.
And then we turn around to give our blind, lame, exhausted, absolutely depleted leftover energy to our spouses, to our children, or even to our own personal growth and health.
The leftovers.
Yes. We give the premium cuts of our lives to the demands of the world and the defective leftovers to the people and principles that are supposedly sacred to us.
That is a very apt and really challenging analogy. The polluted bread of the ancient world is the half-hearted, distracted attention we offer today when we are resentful or just exhausted by our misplaced priorities.
We've all been there.
You sit across the dinner table from someone you promised to love, but you are mentally checked out, offering a lame, blind version of your presence.
But I'm listening to this, and I have to play devil's advocate for a second. I'm thinking, isn't a 60-hour work week enough to justify a little exhaustion?
That's a fair question.
If I am totally burned out from trying to keep a roof over my family's head, isn't showing up half-heartedly better than not showing up at all? I mean, if I'm practically falling asleep on the couch while my kids are playing, isn't the fact that I am physically in the room worth something?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does the universe really expect perfection when we are just trying to survive?
That is a deeply human natural defense mechanism, and it's exactly what the ancient Israelites would have argued. Times are hard, God. Isn't something better than nothing?
Yeah.
But this is where we have to look really closely at the wisdom the text offers, and it's quite shocking. We must distinguish between God rejecting sincere but flawed efforts and God rejecting calculated hypocrisy.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, in Malachi 1.10, God actually provides a devastating answer to that exact mindset. He says, "Oh, that there were one among you who would shut the doors, that you might not kindle fire on my altar in vain."
Wait, shut the doors. He's saying to close down the entire temple.
Yes. God is saying, I would rather you just padlock the doors and shut the whole operation down.
Wow.
It is actually better to do nothing to admit your emptiness and close the doors than to engage in hypocritical, calculated, half-hearted devotion that pretends to be holy.
So just don't fake it.
Exactly. Barnes makes a crucial distinction here. He notes that the divine nature does not despise weakness. God doesn't quench a smoldering wick, right? He accepts imperfect service when it comes from a sincere heart.
So he's not demanding perfection.
No. But what is being violently rejected here is mercenary, corner-cutting, performative service. When we just go through the motions to check a box and appease our own guilt, it breeds a quiet rot inside of us.
It damages us.
It damages our own souls more than if we just possess the raw honesty to admit we are too tired or too disconnected to engage meaningfully.
I love that. It's the difference between saying, I am exhausted, but I am giving you the best of what little I have left, versus saying, I have plenty, but you aren't worth the effort, so here is the bare minimum.
That's the core of it.
If you're listening right now, ask yourself, where are you bringing polluted bread? I mean, really think about it. In what relationships and what commitments are you just going through the motions because you feel secretly resentful or disappointed by how your life turned out?
We really do have to audit the quality of our presence.
We do.
Yeah.
And as we move into the next section, we see that this individual apathy doesn't occur in a vacuum, does it?
Not at all. It is deeply connected to the structures of the society itself. The apathy of the general public flows directly downward from the failure and corruption of their leadership.
The classic trickle-down effect.
Exactly. And this causal link is what brings Malachi to deliver a scathing, unrelenting critique of the priests in the second chapter.
This is where we see the crisis of leadership and really the corruption of the systems that are supposed to hold a community together. In chapter 2, the text says the priests have departed out of the way and have caused many to stumble at the law. And the specific accusation is that they have shown respect for persons, which is the ancient phrasing for partiality, favoritism, and systemic bias.
Matthew Henry points out something crucial regarding the chain of command here. He argues that the people didn't just wake up one day and decide to bring sick animals to the altar.
Right, someone let them in.
The priests were the gatekeepers. If the priests had instructed the people properly, and if they had held the standard high by rejecting the lame animals, the people wouldn't have dared to bring them.
The rot always starts at the top.
It does. The priests were accepting the defective animals because they wanted to keep the populace pacified, and, well, more importantly, they wanted to ensure their own perquisites, their cuts of meat, their social status, their income stream, kept flowing without interruption.
So they were getting paid either way.
Right. They chose their own comfort over their duty to the truth.
They were actively compromising the standard of the entire society for their own personal benefit. I mean, they were supposed to be the moral immune system of the community, and instead, they became the virus.
Exactly. Albert Barnes delves deeply into the original ideal of what was called the Covenant of Levi.
Okay, tell us about that. What was a Levite supposed to be?
In ancient Israel, the tribe of Levi was set apart. They didn't receive a massive land inheritance like the other tribes did. Their role was to be the educators, the judges, the health inspectors, and the spiritual guides of the nation.
So they had a huge responsibility.
Massive. The ideal of this covenant was profound. The text says, the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and he should walk in peace and equity. They were meant to be the objective, incorruptible arbiters of truth and justice.
But they failed.
Completely. They have completely fractured that trust. They are interpreting the rules differently based on the wealth and status of the person standing in front of them.
Ah, so there's a double standard.
A huge one. They are applying the law with brutal strictness to the poor and vulnerable widow, but conveniently looking the other way when a wealthy, influential patron brings a diseased animal to the altar.
Man. It's hard to overstate the profound damage that institutional hypocrisy does to the human psyche.
It's devastating.
When people see leaders, whether that is in a corporate boardroom, in the halls of government, in the media, or within religious institutions operating with blatant, shameless double standards, it acts like an acid on societal trust.
It breeds total cynicism.
It does. It's like, imagine working at a company where the finance executives enforce incredibly strict, draconian expense report rules for junior employees.
Oh, we've all heard stories like this.
Right. A junior associate gets severely reprimanded for expensing a $14 sandwich during a business trip. But then everyone knows those same executives are using the corporate card for lavish $1,000 personal dinners and just writing them off as client meetings.
Yeah.
The moment the junior employees realize the rules only apply to the powerless, company morale just evaporates.
Instantly.
Everyone turns into a cynic, and everyone starts looking for ways to cheat the system themselves because the system has proven itself to be a sham.
That corporate analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of societal collapse. When the people entrusted with the covenant, the literal rules and agreements that bind a society together corrupt those rules for self-interest, the general populace loses faith in the concept of rules entirely.
They just stop caring.
Right. And Malachi delivers a devastating verdict from God to the priests. He says, I have made you contemptible and base before all the people.
Wow. Contemptible.
Yes. Their loss of respect, their sudden irrelevance in the eyes of the public, it isn't a random misfortune. It is the direct, unavoidable consequence of their own lack of integrity. You cannot demand respect for an office when you have degraded the principles that office was built upon.
But, this creates a massive obstacle for the modern person trying to live a good life.
Yeah.
You hear this and you look at the world around you, and it is so easy to feel completely paralyzed.
It really is.
You think, my corporate leaders are corrupt. The political system is gridlocked and self-serving. The institutions I used to trust have failed time and time again. The game is rigged.
Yeah, a lot of people feel exactly that way.
So what can I possibly do about it? I'm just one middle management employee or one parent or one student. If the system is rotten, why shouldn't I just look out for myself?
That is a very real, very raw frustration. And the profound beauty of this ancient text is that it completely validates that anger.
It doesn't sugarcoat it.
It doesn't tell the people to just smile and ignore the corruption. It names the institutional failure as a grievous, destructive wrong. However, the wisdom of the text also lays down a severe challenge.
Would you?
You cannot let the corruption of your leaders become an alibi for your own apathy.
Oof, that's good.
The failure of the system does not absolve you of your personal moral agency. Recognizing this dynamic challenges us to maintain absolute, unyielding integrity in our own spheres of influence, no matter how microscopic they might seem.
Because we still have control over our own actions.
Exactly. You may not sit on the board of directors, but you completely control how you manage your immediate team. You may not control the federal government, but you absolutely control how you speak to your neighbors, how you conduct your business dealings, and how you treat your family.
It's all about that micro-level integrity.
If the rot starts at the top, the rebuilding of a society always starts at the foundational level with radical individual integrity.
Because if we don't hold that line in our own private lives, the breakdown is contagious.
Well, highly contagious.
That breakdown of vertical integrity, our relationship with leadership, with institutions, and ultimately with our highest ideals, it inevitably bleeds horizontally. It seeps into how we treat the people sleeping right next to us.
Yeah, that transition is brutal, but inevitable.
When we lose faith in the macro agreements of society, we start breaking the micro agreements of our personal lives. And that moves us into the most intimate, painful part of Malachi's critique, the epidemic of relational treachery and the tears on the altar.
This is where Malachi pivots from the public sphere to the deeply private. He moves from the temple sacrifices and the corruption of the priesthood directly into the most intimate, vulnerable commitments human beings make with one another.
We're talking about marriage here, right?
Yes. In Malachi 2.0:16, the prophet points out a devastating trend. The people are dealing treacherously with one another. Specifically, the historical context reveals that the men in the community were capriciously divorcing the wife of their youth in order to marry the daughters of foreign gods' women from surrounding pagan nations.
And it's important to understand the economics of this, right? I mean, this wasn't just about, falling out of love. These were calculated, opportunistic moves.
Exactly. Returning to a devastated, poor Judea, some of the Israelite men realized that the fastest way to claim the social and economic ladder was to forge alliances with the wealthy, established merchant families of the surrounding nations, the Ashdodites, the Ammonites, the Moabites.
So they were looking for a bailout.
Right. But to do that, they needed to marry into those families. So they were ruthlessly discarding the women they had married in their youth, women who had endured the poverty and the struggle with them, treating them as disposable stepping stones to secure better real estate and trade deals.
That is sickening.
They were trading in their foundational relationships for a lifestyle upgrade.
And the imagery the prophet uses to describe the fallout of this is just heartbreaking. The text says that God refuses to accept any more of their religious offerings or listen to their prayers because the altar is literally covered with tears. It's covered with weeping and groaning.
Matthew Henry draws a profound theological and psychological conclusion here. He emphasizes that the divine is not just an abstract concept. God is a literal witness to the covenants and vows we make to one another.
So God is paying attention to how we treat people.
Absolutely. The men of Judah were acting as though their private domestic betrayals had absolutely no bearing on their public religious standing.
They compartmentalized it.
Totally. They thought they could abandon their wives on Tuesday and show up to the temple on Saturday to offer a sacrifice, expecting God to bless their crops. But Henry notes that treating a spouse with cruelty, peevishness, or calculated betrayal completely and utterly invalidates one's public persona.
The two cannot exist together.
No, you cannot stand at the altar weeping in pious devotion while the spouse you abandon is weeping tears of sheer devastation over your betrayal. The universe hears the tears of the oppressed, not the prayers of the oppressor.
Wow. And Albert Barnes highlights a visceral, almost terrifying metaphor in the Hebrew text. It says that the man who does this covers his garment with violence. What exactly does that mean in an ancient context?
It is a striking, really inescapable image. In the ancient Near East, a man's garment or cloak was a symbol of his identity, his protection, and his honor.
It was who he was.
Exactly. Barnes explains that when you commit this kind of treachery, you cannot simply wash your hands and walk away clean. The cruelty you inflict envelops you. It stains your very identity like blood on a white robe.
So it sticks to you.
It does. When you treat a human being, especially someone who has bound their life to yours, as a disposable means to an end, that violence to their soul wraps around your own character. You wear your betrayal. It becomes the clothing of your spirit, visible to everyone who truly looks at you.
The translation of this into our modern reality is just undeniable. I mean, we're living through an era characterized by the total commodification of human relationships.
Oh, completely.
We have apps designed to let us swipe through human beings like we are shopping for shoes online. Commitments are so often viewed as entirely disposable the precise moment they become emotionally inconvenient, or, the moment a better offer or a more exciting prospect comes along.
The FOMO of relationships.
Exactly. We ghost people who have invested years in us. We abandon commitments because our culture tells us that our immediate personal self-actualization is the highest possible good, and anyone who gets in the way of that is just collateral damage.
It is deeply connected to the apathy we discussed at the very beginning. When you begin to view your highest ideals and sacred duties as a weariness, it is only a matter of time before you view your human relationships as a weariness too.
That's a scary progression.
When the sacred becomes an inconvenience, other human beings become inconveniences.
But I know that bringing up topics like divorce is incredibly sensitive, and I can hear the modern resistance to this text forming right now. Someone listening is thinking, look, people change. Relationships end. Sometimes marriages are deeply unhealthy and just don't work out. Isn't this text just reflecting ancient, rigid, patriarchal rules about divorce that don't apply to the complexities of modern psychology and modern lives?
That's a very common pushback.
So how do we separate the ancient cultural rigidity from the universal wisdom here?
That is a vital distinction, and we have to exercise careful wisdom and discernment here. As we look at these commentaries, we are not wading into modern political, legal, or cultural debates about the legality or sociology of divorce.
Right, we're looking at the core principle.
Exactly. What we must understand is the highly specific behavior the text is condemning. The operative word in Malachi is treachery.
Treachery.
Yes. The text is condemning the cruel, callous, calculated abandonment of a partner who placed their profound trust in you. It is addressing a situation where one person discards another purely for selfish gain.
Treating them like a stepping stone.
Treating a human being, the companion and wife of your youth, as the text specifically honors her, as if she were a broken tool to be tossed into the scrap heap. It is a severe warning about the devastating psychological and spiritual impact of betrayal.
So it's about deceit. It's about the conscious breaking of a vow for a selfish upgrade. And if we zoom out and look at comparative insight across almost all global wisdom traditions, this holds true.
Everywhere you look.
Whether you are studying Eastern philosophies, the Stoics of Greece and Rome, or modern clinical psychology, the ability to make, honor, and keep a promise is universally seen as the bedrock of human stability.
It's fundamental.
The fidelity to our word is what stabilizes the human soul. And honestly, it is the only thing that stabilizes a society. Without trust, without the belief that words mean something, the entire human project crumbles.
Exactly. The text asks a profound question. Did he not make you one? It speaks to the deep, almost metaphysical unity that is forged in long-term sacrificial commitment. To rip that apart treacherously for shallow reasons is to do violence not just to the other person's heart, but to the architecture of your own soul.
So think about your own life, your own trajectory. How do your private relationships reflect your true underlying values? Are the people closest to you, your family, your closest friends, your business partners shedding tears that invalidate your public success?
That's the real test.
Because you might be absolutely killing it in your career. You might be highly respected in your community, sitting on boards and admired by your peers. But if you are dealing treacherously with the people who trust you the most in private, this ancient wisdom suggests your entire life is a facade built on a foundation of sand. The stains are on your garment, whether the public sees them yet or not.
And when that kind of treachery becomes normalized, when people treat others with cruelty and see no immediate cosmic lightning bolt strike them down, it leads the entire culture into the ultimate toxic mindset. Complete moral cynicism.
Which is exactly what we see in the text.
Yeah.
Malachi 2.17 through 3.6 captures this descent perfectly. The people actually have the sheer audacity to weary God with their words.
They do.
They look around and say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or they throw up their hands and ask, where is the God of justice?
Matthew Henry captures the essence of this ancient, bitter complaint brilliantly. He notes how the people look around their society and see the wicked prospering without consequence.
They see the hypocrites winning.
Yes. The corrupt priests we talked about, they are getting rich off the meat. The treacherous husbands who abandoned their wives, they are getting new, wealthy wives and expanding their landholdings.
And the good people are just struggling.
Exactly. So the general populace, the people trying to live quietly and ethically, look at this and think, what on earth is the point of being good? The universe is broken. God clearly doesn't care. Or worse, he actually rewards the corrupt.
It is the ancient version of the ultimate nice guys finish last complaint. I mean, if the cheaters are winning, why am I playing by the rules?
Precisely. And the response they get from the divine is not a simple comforting pat on the back.
He doesn't coddle them?
Not at all. God doesn't just say, don't worry, I'll get them. Instead, he answers with a terrifying and beautiful promise that turns the mirror back on them. He says the messenger of the covenant is coming, and he will be like a refiner's fire and launderer's soap.
Let's dig into those specific metaphors, because we read words like soap and fire and, well, we think of a warm shower and a cozy fireplace.
Right, it sounds pleasant.
But Albert Barnes does a great job explaining that this is not what the ancient audience pictured at all.
Not even close. Barnes explains that launderer's soap, or fuller's soap in some translations, wasn't like the gentle lavender-scented detergent we use today.
So what was it?
In the ancient world, the process of fulling cloth to clean deeply soiled garments was brutal. The fuller had to use harsh, caustic alkaline soaps made from lye and plant ashes.
Ouch.
Yeah. The cloth was soaked in this caustic mixture and then literally trampled upon by feet, beaten with heavy wooden clubs, and scrubbed violently against rough rocks to force the impurities out and make the fabric pure white.
It sounds like it almost destroys the cloth.
It was a violent, rough, highly destructive process to anything that wasn't the pure fabric itself.
And the refiner's fire carries the same weight, doesn't it?
Yes. A refiner sits over a crucible containing raw, unpurified silver or gold. They turn up the heat, pumping the bellows until the metal literally melts, breaking down its solid form.
It has to completely liquefy.
Exactly. In that intense, blistering heat, all the impurities, the dross, the base metals are forced to float to the top where they can be skimmed off and thrown away. Both the alkaline soap and the crucible fire represent highly uncomfortable, agonizing, but ultimately purifying processes.
This is such a profound, paradigm-shifting perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, it stops you right in your tracks. We all cry out for justice when we are wronged by others. We look at the corrupt politician or the treacherous ex-partner or the unfair boss, and we yell at the universe, "Where is the God of justice? Burn them to the ground."
We want them punished.
Yes. But we completely conveniently forget that absolute justice would have to examine us too. We want a massive forest fire to sweep through and annihilate our enemies, but we absolutely refuse to submit ourselves to a kiln that would burn away our own selfishness, our own apathy, and our own impurities.
This raises one of the most significant obstacles to human growth. We deeply desire a universe that validates our victimhood without ever challenging our complicity.
Oh, that is so true. We love being the victim.
We want the external world fixed, but we don't want to be fixed ourselves. The concept of the refiner's fire is fiercely difficult because it demands painful self-transformation. It forces us to admit that we, too, have dross that needs burning away.
So the practical application here requires a kind of mental judo move. When you find yourself spinning out into deep cynicism about the success of bad actors, when you are lying awake, obsessing over how unfair it is that someone who cuts corners got the promotion, or someone who lies seems to be winning at life, redirect that massive emotional energy into the refiner's fire.
Turn it inward.
Right. Instead of obsessing over their judgment, ask yourself, what dross in my own character needs to be burned away today? How can I use this intense frustration with the world's brokenness to purify my own motives, rather than just letting it turn me into a bitter, hollow cynic?
That internal pivot is the only way out of the cynic's trap. Because if you stay in that trap, your world fundamentally shrinks. You become defensive, paranoid, and closed off.
You just stop trusting anyone.
Exactly. And that psychological shrinking leads us directly into the ultimate test of their society, which Malachi addresses next. The scarcity mindset and the profound challenge to trust.
Right. Because when you are deeply cynical, you fundamentally stop trusting anyone or anything. You close your fist tightly around whatever resources you have. You think, the world is hostile, the system is rigged, so I have to hoard every single thing I have to survive.
It's all self-preservation.
And this brings us to how Malachi confronts their finances in chapter 3.
In Malachi 3:7 to 12, God brings what seems like a shocking, almost aggressive accusation against the people. He plainly accuses them of robbing him in tithes and offerings.
Robbing God, that's a heavy charge.
It is. Under the ancient system, a tenth of their agricultural produce, their grain, their wine, their oil was supposed to be brought to the temple storehouse. But because of their deeply ingrained cynicism and their fear of tomorrow, the people had simply stopped giving. They kept it all for themselves.
And God's response to this is arguably one of the most famous and debated passages in the text. He says, "Test me now in this." He issues a direct challenge. If they bring the full tithe into the storehouse, he promises to open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing so massive there won't be enough room to receive it.
Matthew Henry points out the tragic, vicious cycle that was occurring here. The people were already impoverished by bad crops. The text mentions the devourer, which in an ancient agrarian context meant devastating swarms of locusts or severe drought.
So they were already in trouble.
Yes. Because they were poor and because they saw their crops failing, they stopped giving out of sheer terror. They thought, we literally cannot afford to give 10% away. We will starve.
Which is a totally rational human response.
It is. But God is telling them that their scarcity mindset, their fearful, tight-fisted hoarding is the very mechanism that is keeping them under a curse. Their lack of trust is compounding their poverty.
And Barnes notes how incredibly rare this framing is within the ancient texts. God rarely, if ever, says, "Test me." I mean, usually, testing the divine is strictly forbidden.
Right, you aren't supposed to test God.
But here, God offers a verifiable, almost scientific test of abundance versus hoarding. He essentially says, try it. Open your hands and see what the universe does in response.
The modern translation of this dynamic is the eternal, exhausting battle between a scarcity mindset and an abundance mindset.
We hear those terms a lot today.
We do. The scarcity mindset is a prison. It dictates that there is a finite pie, there isn't enough to go around, and the world is inherently hostile. Therefore, I must fiercely hoard my money, my time, my expertise, and even my love, because if I give any of it away, I will be permanently depleted.
And what's the alternative?
The abundance mindset, however, posits that generosity is the engine of abundance. Opening your hands creates a dynamic flow of resources, goodwill, and community trust.
Now, I have to call out the elephant in the room here. When a modern listener hears a phrase like, give your money to God, and he will open the windows of heaven and make you rich, alarm bells go off.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds dangerously close to a transactional, late-night televangelist prosperity gospel. You know, plant a seed of $1,000 and God will give you a Mercedes. How do we navigate that?
That is a highly necessary warning, and applying wisdom with discernment here is critical. If we look closely at the historical context, we see that this is emphatically not a cosmic vending machine.
It's not a transaction.
No, you don't put a coin of devotion in the slot to get a material blessing out. We have to understand what the storehouse actually was.
We'll live it.
In ancient Israel, the temple wasn't just a building where priests chanted it. It was the central economic engine and the ultimate social safety net of the nation. The grain brought to the storehouse was used to feed the Levites who had no land, but it was also the welfare system for the widows, the orphans, and the immigrant foreigners who had no other means of survival.
Oh, wow. So when they held back?
By holding back their tithes out of fear, the people were literally starving the most vulnerable members of their own community.
They were isolating themselves and letting their neighbors go hungry to protect their own stockpiles.
Exactly. By challenging them to open their hands and give to the storehouse, God is commanding them to break the psychological stronghold of fear. When they give, they rebuild the community trust that had been shattered.
It's a total shift in perspective.
It is. They acknowledge that they are stewards of the resources they've been given, not absolute owners who must frantically, violently defend their pile of grain. It is a profound reorientation of the human heart away from panic self-preservation and toward communal trust and mutual care.
So it's much less about getting rich and entirely about breaking the spell of scarcity that turns us into miserable hoarders, which makes the practical action for this remarkably tangible.
Yes, it's very actionable.
Think about where you are holding back right now out of a fear of not having enough. Maybe it's your finances, but maybe it's your time you refuse to mentor someone because you're afraid they'll take your job. Maybe it's your emotional energy. You withhold a word of encouragement or forgiveness because you feel too depleted or proud.
Generosity takes many forms.
The challenge is to practice a specific act of unreasonable generosity this week. Give something away that feels slightly uncomfortable and watch how it alters your internal psychological weather. Watch how it breaks the grip of anxiety.
And that profound psychological shift brings us to the culmination of Malachi's message. Because while the vast majority of the society we've discussed falls deeply into hoarding, apathy, treachery, and cynicism, a small, quiet group chooses an entirely different path.
This is the beautiful shift in Malachi chapter 3, starting in verse 13, running to the end of the book. You have the arrogant, loud voices in the culture claiming it is vain to serve God, declaring that the whole system is a joke.
Right, the loudest voices are the cynics.
But then the text pivots and says, Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him.
Albert Barnes beautifully decodes this imagery for us. He points out that God, being omniscient, obviously doesn't require a literal physical ledger book to remember things.
This doesn't have a notepad.
Right. The Book of Remembrance is a profound human metaphor designed to assure us that absolutely no act of quiet integrity, no hidden moment of faithfulness goes unnoticed by the universe.
That is so encouraging.
In a society where the wicked are celebrated and the corrupt get wealthy, these faithful people might feel invisible. But God calls them his jewels or his special treasure.
Even when the culture ignores them or mocks them as naive, their integrity is permanently recorded.
Yes. And Matthew Henry notes the stark, dramatic contrast in the final judgment described in chapter 4. For the proud, the cynical, and the treacherous, the day comes burning like an oven that leaves neither root nor branch.
What does that mean?
It is a picture of the total consuming destruction of the ego and the false exploited structures they built their lives upon. But for the faithful, the imagery shifts entirely. The Son of Righteousness rises with healing in its wings, and the text says they will go out and leap like calves of the stall.
I cannot get enough of that specific imagery. The calves released from the stall. The modern translation of this whole section is about the absolute necessity of finding your people.
Yes, speaking to one another.
In a deeply cynical, toxic culture, finding a community of shared values, those who speak to one another, is vital for your psychological and spiritual survival. You simply cannot hold on to your integrity in total isolation.
And the joy depicted in that metaphor of the calves is profound. Henry calls it an image of boundless, uncontainable energy. A calf that has been cooped up in a dark, tight stall all winter, finally let out into the spring pasture, it literally leaps uncontrollably.
Think about the times in your life you've felt something even close to that. It is the feeling of stepping out into the fresh air and bright sunlight after being trapped in a dark, suffocating environment for years.
The relief is palpable.
If you've ever finally quit a highly toxic workplace, or walked away from an emotionally manipulative relationship, or even just managed to break a decade-long cycle of crushing negative self-talk, you know exactly what that leaping feels like.
It's pure freedom.
You feel physically lighter. You feel like bounding around because the heavy, suffocating weight of cynicism and fear has finally been lifted off your chest. It is the ultimate picture of psychological and spiritual liberation.
To connect this all to the grand narrative, we have to look at the very final words of Malachi. These are not just the end of this deep dive. They are the final words of the Christian Old Testament before centuries of silence.
What are those final words?
The prophet promises that Elijah will come to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest the earth be struck with a curse.
Generational healing.
Exactly. To avoid total societal destruction, which is the ultimate curse, the healing cannot just be economic or political. It must be relational, and it must be generational.
It has to go deep.
The massive, cynical breakdown of society we've traced today, starting from apathetic worship, flowing into corrupt leadership, trickling down into broken marriages and treacherous betrayals, and resulting in hoarded wealth, is ultimately only reversed by turning our hearts back to the next generation. It is about taking the long, sacrificial view of love, fidelity, and commitment, ensuring we leave a foundation of trust, not a legacy of cynicism.
Which leaves you with one last profound thing to ponder. We talked about that book of remembrance, that beautiful metaphor that the universe records every quiet act of goodness.
It's a powerful thought.
Think about your life right now. If every single word of integrity you spoke to a friend today, every time you maintained your standard when no one was looking, and every single time you consciously refused to give your leftovers to your loved ones, was being written down in a permanent cosmic record, how would that change the way you act this very afternoon? When the history of your life is read, are you going to be a participant in the cynical breakdown of society, or are you part of the quiet, enduring remnant bringing generational healing?
It's the ultimate choice.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.